Hello, I'm Mark Payne with the West Virginia Humanities Council. Welcome to History Alive. History Alive is a program of the Humanities Council that brings historical figures to life through first-person portrayals by presenters who have conducted thorough research into their character. The Humanities Council makes these characters available to both nonprofit and for-profit organizations across West Virginia. History Alive is designed as an interactive experience between the character and the audience. They are entertaining and educational. We encourage your organization, school, or event to host a presentation and bring a figure from history for a visit with your audience or students. Having someone like Harriet Tubman or Stonewall Jackson come to speak to your group can breathe life into these historical figures. Nothing compares to the live, in-person visit. Each presentation consists of 3 parts: a monologue, a question-answer session with the character, and then the presenter breaks character to answer questions about how he or she conducted their research. Our History Lab presenters have researched a variety of sources such as diaries, journals, letters, official documents, autobiographies, and the research of other scholars in developing their character. A History Lab presentation is not a play. It's an audience participation event that relies on interaction between the audience and the character. Being able to ask your own questions of these important figures from the past is a unique experience. It's difficult to reproduce the feel of an actual History Live presentation here in the studio. Without an audience to ask questions, we'll change the format a bit and have our guests sit with me for a few questions after the monologue. But we hope to give a sample of how a History Live presentation can add to your program offerings. There will be information on the screen at the end of this program for how to contact the Humanities Council about bringing a History Live character to your community. At this time, I would like to welcome today's guest from history. We are pleased to have with us in the studio today, Cousin Minnie Pearl.
Howdy! Well, I'm just so proud to be here. I come all the way from Grinder Switch, and you know, I love my home Grinder Switch, but there's one thing that I like to get away for, and it's that they won't let me sing. They say it upsets the dogs too much. Lucifer Hecklehead said he had to take his dog to one of them psychiatrists. But I bet the dogs here are not as weak as the dogs in Grinder Switch. So I'm going to sing you a song. It's called How to Catch a Man. How to catch a man, how to catch a man. Girls are always asking me, how do you catch a man? Catch him while you can with a Minnie Pearl plan. Hog time. And that there is how you catch a man. Well, I reckon that didn't hurt the dogs too much, did it? Well, I have to admit, I do like the fellers. I like to kiss, especially. I put my lips up against anybody. Well, I even kissed Cary Grant. I did. You know, I was out in Los Angeles to be on that Dean Martin television show, and I was walking down that Sunset Boulevard, and Cary Grant was walking with his dog, and he called his dog to him like this. And I got in the way. Well, I have to make a confession now. I'm not Cousin Minnie Pearl. My name is really Sarah Ophelia Cauley Cannon. And I was born in Centerville, Tennessee in 1912. And I was the youngest of 5 daughters. And I'll admit it, I was a mistake. And my father, he was hoping there at the end for a boy, finally. But I turned out to be a girl. And so he decided he was going to turn me into a tomboy. And that didn't set too well with my mama, because she was used to raising young ladies, you know. But my daddy, he turned me into a tomboy, and he let me ride horses and all that sort of thing. And he was the wealthiest man in Centerville, Tennessee. He owned a bunch of lumber yards, and I have to admit, you know, when people think about Minnie Pearl, they associate me with the Grand Ole Opry, but back in those days, I didn't care about the Grand Ole Opry. I didn't like that sort of music. We called it hillbilly music back in those days, and I didn't pay any attention to it really. I liked popular music, and I liked jazz. And I was going to be, as I got older and decided what I wanted to do, I was going to go off and be a great, serious actress, dramatic actress. I wanted to do Shakespeare, and I wanted to do Broadway plays. And that was my hope, and that's what my daddy was hoping for too. He was going to support me, and he sent me to Ward Belmont, which is this finishing school for young ladies in Nashville, and there I studied what we didn't call it drama back in those days, because young ladies weren't supposed to. Actually, the theater was still sort of risque and so forth. So they didn't talk about drama. They talked about expression. So I studied expression classes at Ward Belmont, and I know I was going to go off to New York, and I was going to study drama at the American Academy of Dramatic Arts. Well, that didn't happen, because this event came along that y'all may have heard of called the Great Depression. And my daddy lost all his money during the Great Depression, and so I had to go out and find a job somewhere when I finished at Ward Belmont. So I ended up working for a dramatic company called the Wayne Sewell Productions, and this was a sort of an old-fashioned thing, and it was on its way out during the 30s, because as you can imagine, folks were getting radios, and they were going to the movies and so forth, so they didn't want to go to little silly productions anymore. But Wayne Sewell they would send a director out to little towns to do productions, and they would get the local school teachers and the local bankers and the local lawyers and so forth to try out for this play, and they put on this silly little play, and then they'd go to the next town and do the same thing. And so I was one of those directors. I was supposed to go out and set up these shows, and in order to promote them, I would go to the local civic organizations, and I would give a presentation about the play. Well, I got bored with doing that over time, because I wanted to do something myself dramatically. And so I was in a little town called Baileyton, Alabama, and I was going to set up the play there, and they put us up in different places. So they put me up with this little old lady who I thought of then as a little old lady. She really wasn't that old. She was probably in her 40s. But they sent me to stay with her in this log cabin with her and her family, because this was Baileyton's a little town up in the foothills of Alabama. Wasn't any hotel or anything like that. So I stayed with this family, and this lady fascinated me. She was real funny, and she told stories, and her family was odd. Her son was called Brother. And so I sort of studied this lady and started to listen to the way she talked, and I thought about her after I left that town and went to other places, and I started thinking of a fictional character that I could base this on this lady, and I started thinking of the names of country people, my favorite country names, and I thought, well, I like Minnie, and I like Pearl, and so I decided to call her Minnie Pearl. And I decided to become that character, and I started thinking of stories that I could tell about the family, like Brother. You know, Brother, he's not wound too tight sometimes. Brother and his friend Lynn Perkins, they decided they was going to make some money. They were going to go to Ohio and buy some bales of hay, because down in Grand Ole Switch, they ain't no big farms that produce bales of hay. So they got a truck, and they went up to Ohio, and they bought bales of hay for $5 a bale. And they come back down to Grand Ole Switch, and they sold them bales of hay for $5 a bale. And then they counted up their money, and Liam said, "We didn't make no money." And Brother said, "Well, maybe next time we need to get a bigger truck." So that's the way Brother thinks. So I thought of stories like that, and I thought of Uncle Nabob and Aunt Ambrosie. Aunt Ambrosie was sitting on the front porch one day. She was shelling beans, and they were the first people, by the way. They were so old that they were the first people to see an automobile in Grand Ole Switch. So she's sitting there shelling beans, and she sees this varmint coming down the road and making all this noise and racket and bouncing around, and she throwed up her bowl of beans, and she ran into the house, and she said, "Nabob, get your gun. There's a varmint coming down the road. Go kill it." And so he got his gun, and she went on running into the kitchen, and she looked out the window, and she heard the Nabob shooting, blam, 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 blam. And then she seen this fella running off into the woods. And so she come back out, and Nabob came in the house, and she said, "Nabob, did you kill it?" And he said, "No, but I made it let go of that fella it had a hold of." So I thought of stories like that, and I would lay awake at night thinking about stories, who Minnie Pearl knows, and what she's going to talk about, and I started performing these instead of wanting to talk about the little play we were putting on. I started talking about Minnie Pearl. Well, the Wayne Soil Company went under about that time, and my mama got sick, and I went back to Centerville to take care of her, and I really felt like a total failure. It was 1939. And I had no money, I had no job, and all my acting dreams seemed to be gone. But the local Lions Club asked me to come perform Minnie Pearl for them. By that time I had bought a dress for her, and I had bought a hat for her, and because I was trying to dress her up like a country girl who would go to town. And so I had performed for the local Lions Club, so there was a bankers convention coming to Centerville, and so they asked me to perform her there as well. And so I did that, and turns out one of the bankers at that convention was friends with folks at WSM Radio in Nashville, Tennessee, where the Grand Ole Opry is. And they asked me to come and try out for the Grand Ole Opry. Well, I didn't know anything about the Grand Ole Opry. Like I said, I didn't know anything about hillbilly music. And but of course I needed the job, and so I said, sure, I'd like to do that. So I was nervous. I went to Nashville to audition, and they put me on. They were going to put me on the very last part of the show at 11:30, because they were a little worried about my show after I auditioned. They said, well, we're afraid that people are going to think you're making fun of them, and that's our audience, and we don't want our audience to think you're making fun. And I didn't want them to think that either, but I wanted people to laugh with me, and I wanted them to think of Minnie Pearl as their friend. So I was waiting to go on for the first time at 11:30 at night, when they thought nobody would be here, and Judge George D. Hay, who's the Grand Ole Opry founder, as you know, he was standing with me waiting for me to go on, and he said, "You're nervous, aren't you, honey?" And I said, "Yes, sir." He said, "Well, you just go out there and love them, and they'll love you right back." And so I never forgot that, and I always tried to remember that when I was performing. And that performance, actually, I went home not knowing what would happen, but that week, come to find out, all this fan mail started pouring in. People really liked Minnie Pearl, and as they say, the rest is history. I began to perform with the Opry. I was the first woman to be a performer on the Grand Ole Opry. Now, there were a few women who had performed with bands on the Opry, but I was the first woman to actually, as a single act, to be on the Grand Ole Opry. That was started in 1940. I'm very proud of that. It was definitely a man's world. But we toured a lot back then. We were on the road, as we called it. We would take out on a Monday, and we would travel around all week from one little town in the south to another. And then we'd come back on Friday night, and we'd do the Opry on Saturday, and then we'd do the whole thing again on Monday. So I was on the road constantly. Back in those days, it was hard. We would travel 6 people to a car. We didn't even have buses back then. We would travel in cars. So there I was, the only woman. And all these fellers, which actually helped add to the act, but all these fellers, about that time I was in my late 20s, and most of the fellers were these young boys from off the farm, and we still call it hillbilly music. They were hillbilly musicians, and many of them didn't know anything. I taught them how to write checks, for example. I taught them how to set up bank accounts and how to balance the checkbook. And I helped them with their girlfriend advice and all that sort of thing. They sort of thought me as the big sister, and they took care of me. I never had any problem with being harassed or anything like that, because my boys took care of me all over when we traveled and so forth. If my mama could have seen me, I was sitting in the back seat with 2 fellers, passing the whiskey bottle around. They wouldn't have liked. She would have had a fit. But and I would not have survived those days, by the way, if after a while I saw the road chew up a lot of people, because it was a hard life. But I was fortunate to meet my husband, Henry Cannon, who was a pilot. He was a pilot during World War II, and he helped take over my life and run my business and side of things and look out for me. So World War II, by the way, was a terrible thing, but it was for my career and for the Grand Ole Opry. It was changing because it brought country music to the nation for the first time, and people from all over the country were getting exposed to different kinds of music, and so people from New York or California were hearing the first country music they'd ever heard. And we used to tour to bases during World War II, and so our music was being heard by soldiers from all over the country. And it was exciting for Minnie, by the way, because Minnie would go to these bases and she would have these fellers who would meet her. And they had armbands on with her initials on them, MP. And Minnie thought that was the most wonderful thing. They were good-looking fellers, too. So it was good for Minnie's career as well. So anyway, after World War II, the Grand Ole Opry and country music took off and became known nationally, and Minnie became known nationally, and that's I was on the road then, either touring with the Grand Ole Opry or going out to, by then flying. My husband Henry was flying me out to California and places like that, and I was on variety shows all over the country and on all the networks, and the Opry was picked up nationally, and that was a really important time. So as they say, the rest is history. I would like to end by just saying that I'm often asked, well, where's Grinder Switch? And I used to say Grinder Switch it was just a railroad switching station right outside of my hometown of Centerville, Tennessee. But I don't say that anymore because I thought about it. And Grinder Switch is a state of mind. It's a place where there's no sorrow, there's no war, there's no political unrest, there's no illness. It's a place where the only thing you have to worry about is what you're going to wear to the ice cream social that night and whether or not your fella is going to kiss you on the way home. So I hope for you all a Grinder Switch. Thank you.
I'm here with Sarah Cauley, otherwise known as Minnie Pearl. Sarah, I'd like to thank you for taking time out of your busy schedule to be here with us today.
Thank you. I appreciate it.
I was listening to some of the things you were talking about earlier, and I think it's maybe surprising to a lot of people that you were really sort of a serious student of theater. You come from a family of some means, but then the Depression hit.
Right.
And that had to be sort of a disappointing thing when it happened, that you weren't able then to pursue your serious studies of theater and whatnot. Could you talk a little bit about that?
Well, I was. I wasn't the only person. There were so many thousands and millions of people in the same boat who had their lives upended by it, and just had to rethink what was going to happen. And it was hard for me. I was at a vulnerable age, but I was also, I think you're resilient when you're young like that. And so I just resolved that I was going to have to try some new adventures. Yeah. And it did, what I decided to do in terms of working with the theatrical troupe that I was working with is I did get to travel a lot. I saw the world. Mm. So.
Well, you mentioned also that the Depression hit your father and your family pretty hard. Your father being I don't know I want to say wealthy, but certainly a well-to-do timber, lumber operator. Did your family ever recover from the financial hit during the Depression?
Not really, not until I became famous myself and was able to help my mother. But by then my father had passed away a number of years before. He never saw my fame. He passed away before I was on the Grand Ole Opry, and I think it was hard. He's the person it was hard on. He was much older than my mother, first of all, and then I was the youngest of 5 daughters, and so he was really he could have been my grandfather, and he was in poor health the last few years of his life, and dealing with, and I'm sure the financial loss contributed to that.
Yeah. So then you auditioned for and made it on to the Grand Ole Opry, which
Right.
is a huge, huge deal. And I don't know, it certainly became a huge deal, and it was a pretty big deal at the time in 1940, right?
Well, it actually wasn't as much so, because it was more, the Opry was not famous nationally in 1940. And,
More regional then?
It was regional. It was in the Southeast, basically. And I still had those dreams and aspirations of getting to New York and being more famous for more serious acting. So I was with the Opry for several years before I accepted the reality that that's not only where I was going to be, but that's actually where the good Lord put me to be.
Did you have a favorite Opry act during your time there?
Well, there were so many acts that are so wonderful, but and so I'm probably a little prejudiced because it was based on my personal friendship as much as anything else. Roy Acuff was just a dear friend and became a dear friend for well, until now. And Roy and I go way back, and we just hit it off. And he's the first person to fire me, by the way. I toured with I toured with his band in my first year with the Opry, and it wasn't working very well. And I was still finding my way with the act. I still wasn't exactly sure where the act should go. And he just sat me down and said, "Honey, this is not working." And it, so I went home to Nashville and cried, and it was the best thing that ever happened to the act, though, because it made me really get my head together, and brought in my sister Virginia to start writing jokes for me, because I was trying to write my own jokes, and Virginia was a much better writer than I was, so kind of retooled Minnie, and so then I went back and toured with Roy and with Bill Monroe and Pee Wee King and all kinds of different folks.
Well, Bill Monroe is one of my favorites, so I'm glad you toured with him. So, and like you said, you toured, you were on the road a good bit. When and why did you determine to come off of the road and quit traveling quite as much as you did?
When I first married my husband Henry, he wanted me to get off the road then, and I was off the road for about 6 months, and it drove me crazy. And he finally said, "Well, I guess this is what you have to do." It's almost like an addiction, the road is. It really sticks with you. So I was on the road. If you told me in 1940 this would be the case, but I was on the road with the Grand Ole Opry for 27 years. I didn't get off the road until 1967. And it happened because I was flying back. My husband Henry was a pilot. He was flying me back from an engagement, and we were over Knoxville, Tennessee, and our engine on our plane just went out. And he said, "Honey, I gotta set this down." And so he landed us in a field outside of Knoxville, Tennessee, and we didn't know if the plane was going to explode or what, and it didn't. And he never flew again. And I said, I think this is actually a good time to reassess my life, and maybe I don't have to work so hard, and maybe I can stay in Nashville and do the Opry now and then, and otherwise just play tennis and swim and hang out with my friends, and not push so hard. So that's really when I went off the road.
Well, at this time, I'd like to point out that this isn't really Sarah Cauley, or AKA Minnie Pearl. This is really Denise Giardina. Denise, thanks so much for being here. Denise is one of our newer History Live presenters, and I'm going to ask you what I ask everybody on this program, which is, what was it about the character of Minnie Pearl that grabbed you to the point that you wanted to do the research and do these portrayals?
Well, I had decided I wanted to do History Live, but I didn't really want to do somebody serious. I didn't want to talk about, a Clara Barton chopping off soldiers' legs during the Civil War, and that I just really didn't want to talk about depressing things. And I thought I want to do somebody who's funny, and so I thought I made a list on my refrigerator. And the first one I thought it was Minnie Pearl, because I had performed in a play back in the 1990s, and a character that I kind of based on Minnie Pearl. And in a Shakespeare play, by the way. And so I put down Minnie Pearl, and then I couldn't think of anybody else, and days passed, and I finally said, well, I'm just going to look something up about her. So I looked her up on Wikipedia and immediately saw her birthday, October 25th, 1912. Well, my birthday's October 25th, 1951. And so I said, well, Minnie,
connection.
That we're connected, so it's going to be Minnie. And that's really how I chose her. And then once I started researching her more, I really felt more and more strongly that I just felt some kind of a connection with her.
Were there any particular sources when you were doing your research and trying to find out more about her, when you were pulling the character together for her, that you might be able to suggest for people if they would like to learn more about Minnie Pearl or Sarah Cauley, the lady who actually developed that Minnie character?
I think the best one is her autobiography, the autobiography of Minnie Pearl. And I think it's, with autobiographies, you can never tell how honest a person's being in a way, but I think she really is being pretty honest, and she's pretty open about, she doesn't try to pull punches in some cases, and that's got a lot of information in it, and it's also got a lot of information about the Grand Ole Opry too. There's also a book of jokes called The Best Jokes Minnie Pearl Told, and some that she didn't, and it was by one of her joke writers, and it's also got some personal reminiscences of her by a number of Grand Ole Opry folks, and then there's all kinds of stuff on the internet, and any history of the Grand Ole Opry that you would pick up, there's going to be a bunch of stuff about Minnie Pearl in there also.
Yeah, I know that you can find a lot of stuff on YouTube and some early stuff she did with Rod Brassfield.
I recommend going to YouTube and looking at some of those clips. And my favorite one was her performances with Dean Martin. I thought those were fun.
What were?
Well, she was on the Dean Martin show, and the interesting thing to me about it is that she's not a polished performer in a lot of ways, and she made some mistakes, including in that clip. She forgets the words to the little Jimmy Dix's song, "May the Bird of Paradise Fly Up Your Nose," and I think Dean had probably had a little too much to drink at some
Dean
point.
blew a line or two.
He did. They both, but they were having a fun time, and the audience was just loved it, and that's the kind of performer she was, and she was, at one point she stepped on Dean's foot, and he's like, "Oh," and she's like, "Oh, you got another one," And, I mean, she just, it's just a lot of fun to watch that clip. So.
Well, now Sarah Cauley had dealt with some more serious aspects in her life as well.
Yeah, Sarah Cauley married Henry Cannon and became Sarah Cannon, and the reason I emphasize that is that if you go to Nashville or Kentucky and many small towns too, you'll see a Sarah Cannon Cancer Center. And she had breast cancer, she had double mastectomy, and gave a lot of money subsequently to cancer causes. Was
that in the 60s,
This
70s?
Was in the 1980s, 1987. And she, because she and her husband, she was wealthy and they didn't have children, so she gave a lot of money to charitable causes, and a lot of money to cancer. And so the cancer center in Nashville is called the Sarah Cannon Cancer Center, and it eventually spread to several other towns in Tennessee and Kentucky, and so she became a spokesperson for breast cancer awareness. And I actually had a breast cancer diagnosis myself right after I started doing Minnie Pearl, and I told Sarah Cannon, "I wanted your birthday, but I didn't want to share your cancer." But I've used every one of my performances since then to raise this up and say, "Ladies, get your mammograms."
Here in the last 30 seconds of the show, what were the circumstances at the end of her life? It wasn't really. She survived her cancer.
She survived her cancer. She had a stroke in 1991 and went into a nursing home, and then she passed away in 1996 after several years in the nursing home.
Okay. Well, once again, Denise, thanks so much for being part of our History Alive program and traveling the state doing her programs. And thank you for tuning in to History Alive.